Hello, everyone. It's Professor Buzzkill. It's March. Usually in March, we try to have an Irish-themed episode, and we have one now. And fortunately for you, it's a very good episode, and it's a very serious episode. And one of the things that's always bugged me about St. Patrick's Day is the frivolity of it, and it's a perfect time to look into serious questions about Ireland and Irish America, but we tend in the United States to make it a sort of a joke holiday. Thankfully for me and thankfully for you, Professor Mary Burke is on the line via the internet, here to discuss her book, Race, Politics, and Irish America, A Gothic History. Dr. Burke, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Joe, thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be here.
It's a great book. Even though I'm not a literature scholar and I had to look a few things up as I was reading it, I really was drawn in, partly because I really love to read about Irish America's diverse identities. And we tend to have, in the United States especially, this one version of what an Irish American is. First of all, it's limited to Boston and New York and to North America, but you show how diverse the identities are across the entirety of the Americas.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess my starting point with that was as somebody, I suppose, who moved from Ireland to America, was thinking about what the term Irish America means. And of course, as I understood it when I first arrived, it meant, post-famine, post-1845 famine, white, Catholic, northeastern seaboard, as you said. But so in the end, I wanted to expand that hugely, and I ended up looking at representations of 400 years of Irish presence in the Americas. So I really wanted to push that boundary of what Irish is. So I looked at the cultural legacies, what gets left behind after all of these waves of Irish. So I start with the forcibly transported Irish in the 17th century, the Scots-Irish, the Ulster Presbyterian Irish of the 18th century, and of course the post-famine Catholic immigrants, as well as mixed race Irish Americans. I looked at a whole diverse range of people, to black and white writers, performers, politicians, public figures in the Americas. And I suppose what I was really interested in is the connections as well, Joe, between the two countries. I think the Irish brought their really disordered, their traumatic history with them when they came to America. They brought sectarianism, they brought settler colonial violence. That was violence they'd experienced, violence they'd inflicted in the motherland. So because of that, I think that complicated history, they became colluders in oppression in America, but they also became victims of oppression in America. So I tried to do a very kind of even-handed history. As you say, I'm a scholar of literature, but I'm really interested as well in Irish history. And I think the really absolute beginning point of this book was reading canonical American American writers like Fitzgerald and Henry James and so on, and seeing Irish history there. I think American scholars often ignore Irish history in relation to writers of Irish connections, but the writers themselves do not. And I think they're really interested in looking at the history of both Ireland and the Americas. And I think Eugene O'Neill in particular does that. He has plays that seem to be about America, but they're actually about the seizure of both Gaelic and Indigenous American lands. I'm thinking of a play like Desire Under the Elms in particular.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And one of the big aspects of the book, as you have indicated just now, really is race in Irish America. We tend to think purely of pure white people coming from Ireland to the Americas, and there's a lot more to it.
Right. Yeah, I guess I even think about whiteness itself as a racial category. I think my starting point as a scholar was Noel Ignatieff, whose really important book from the 90s. It looked at the transformation of the famine generation Irish from what he called kind of an off-whiteness, not fully white, to, again, eventually a mainstream whiteness. I think the crux of what Ignatieff says is not celebratory. He says that the oppressed became the oppressors, effectively, that the post-famine immigrants, they achieved acceptance amongst, an initially kind of quite hostile Anglo-America. They achieved that by being even more pitiless in their dealings with African Americans than the nativists themselves. What I found writers of Irish descent or connection was that they both critiqued and sometimes they condoned, for somebody like Margaret Mitchell's, maybe sometimes they condoned this pursuit of whiteness by the Irish, that they considered a kind of a cultural possession of, so-called Anglo-Saxon America. So again, I suppose I'd say, yes, of course, in popular culture, race evokes people of color, But I think, the fact that Ignatieff suggests that the Irish gained whiteness gives us a sense of whiteness as a racial category too. And I think what I'm interested in saying in my book is that they achieved whiteness not once, but multiple times in the Americas.
Well, I'm glad you said that because we're going to talk more about that. But to start with, could you give us what you have in an important part of your book, the three racialized labels of the Irish in the Americas? And I would say Americas plural because, again, one of the whole big points of your book is it's not just Boston and New York.
Right. Yeah, I actually go to the Caribbean. I feel like with the Irish in the Americas, for me, it was the starting point that I had to sort of encompass, So yeah, the three, I suppose, racialized labels the Irish acquired over centuries and shook off once they acquired their full whiteness were redlegs, Scots-Irish, and Black Irish. Black Irish as applied to sort of the white Irish. But I'll start with the redlegs, I think, right?
Mm.
In southern United States, it was only the northernmost outpost of a plantation system that, of course, encompassed the Caribbean colonies too. And I think we mostly know, that thousands were forcibly shipped out of Ireland to the Caribbean after Cromwell's 1649 conquest. What I was interested in was the fact that the Irish acquired the designation red leg then in the Caribbean. I see that as a racialization. And they were called red leg because their extreme paleness gave them a tendency to sunburn. So they acquired this as a racialized term. So another important factor for me was that in the late 17th century in Barbados, the Irish redlegs, as they were called in the documents, and enslaved Africans, they conspired together to resist or kill their masters. And as a result of this tendency to conspire, a strict differentiation was made in law between white transportee and enslaved Black. So for the first time in the Americas, I think the Irish became white. And how is that relevant to literature? Well, I think somebody like F. Scott Fitzgerald, whose work shows an absolute obsession with skin tone and whiteness, I think he drew on this 17th century stigmatizing of the Irish as too pale. I think that informs his really counterintuitive use of tanned skin to signal elite whiteness. The reason that's relevant is that the fashion for white people to sort of signal their elite status by tanning was actually cemented by Fitzgerald's Riviera Circle in the 1920s. Before that, for white people, tanned skin had been a hallmark of low status and outdoor work.
Sure. Well, that's redlegs, that's Caribbean. I think most Americans, or most Irish Americans, and certainly the people who call themselves Scots-Irish, will know about Scots-Irish, but your book brings up so much more about that label.
It's a really interesting label. I suppose we have to go back, as I kept doing with my book, I have to go back always to Ireland and to Irish history to sort of start with explaining any particular term. So they were the Ulster-Scots. They were lowland Scottish Presbyterian. They took over confiscated Gaelic land in 17th century Ulster, what is now, for the most part, Northern Ireland. And they themselves subsequently departed for colonial America in very large numbers and in various waves. One of my favorite statistics, I think, in the book, or numbers in the book, is that by 1790, one half of the 400,000 US residents who are labeled Irish were actually Ulster descent. Patrick Griffin has written very well about them, and he's written that their initial use in Ireland as a bulwark between English and native Gael, that this was repeated in America. The Ulster-Irish, what became Scots-Irish, they occupied unauthorized tracts of land that were unpurchased from Native Americans. And so Griffin describes them as being ambiguously between European and native, between legitimacy and illegitimacy, and importantly for me, between white and non-white. And I think Benjamin Franklin underlines this view of them. In 1763, there was an indiscriminate massacre of Native Americans by Scots-Irish perpetrators, and Benjamin Franklin called them Christian white savages, which of course implies a flawed whiteness. So they were a really insecure population, in other words, and in both realms, you could say they did the dirty work, really, of a much more entrenched colonial class. So I think, as always, I tend to sort of try to bring that history to bear upon a well-known literary text. And in this case, I was thinking of the 1799 American Gothic novel, the first Gothic novel in America, called Edgar Huntley. And I think in it, I read the dual usage of the Ulster-Irish on both sides of the Atlantic in their presence. In this novel, it connects Scots-Irish violence on the frontier of two Anglo colonies, Dublin and Pennsylvania.
Well, do you mind telling me why, or more importantly, telling everyone out there, why there seems to have been an exclusion in the popular mind, anyway, with what you might call Ulster American writers rather than Irish American writers? We get so much literature and so many literary preconceptions of the Irish American writer coming from, frankly, the non-Ulster parts of Ireland. And yet there is this whole strain of Ulster American writers who you talk about. It's fascinating. Why has that been excluded?
Maybe the beginning point of that is that the more, I suppose we could say, the white Anglo-Saxon coinage of Scots-Irish, that this really starts to gain currency, really after the influx of the poor Catholic Irish during and after the 1845 famine. So, in short, the Presbyterian Ulster-Irish, they begin to whiten, I suppose, at about the point that the Catholic Irish arrive, and they become more and more associated with Anglo-America. So their Irishness melts away, at least in certain locations, in the Northeast in particular. So as a result, I think this category of Irish American literature, it has easily and customarily excluded writers of Ulster Presbyterian origin. And you'd be amazed at the major names who come under that category. I'm talking about Henry James, John Steinbeck, Edgar Allan Poe. These are all of that ancestry.
Well, then the third racialized label you have in the book, and the label that scholars use, is Black Irish. I think our listeners would like to know what that means.
I've called this the third racialized designation, the white Irish, and I have to be very clear about that. I'm talking here about the white Irish that they acquired in America. So obviously the post-famine Catholic Irish, they were initially racialized, and then they eventually whitened on America's eastern seaboard. And that third, I suppose, full assimilation to elite status, that will be central to the stories of Grace Kelly and John F. Kennedy, who are both of that origin. What intrigued me about the term Black Irish, and I think something that hasn't been examined, is that it suggests an existing white Irishness. And who were white Irish by this point? I think it was Protestant Irish America. And just to give you a sense of how long the phrase kind of lasted in sort of usage amongst the Irish themselves, in 1933, F. Scott Fitzgerald, the great Irish American novelist, he described himself as Black Irish in a letter to a fellow Irish American author, John O'Hara. They were writing about their modest Irish roots. And O'Hara had introduced himself to Fitzgerald as the son of a Black Irish doctor. So I think that this in 1933 is used by these two writers. The phrase Black Irish, it signals really ambiguous placement within America's hierarchy, of race, of ethnicity, of class. And something else I want to stress is that, of course, American people of color sometimes identified as Irish too. I was really interested in Frank Yerby. He was a Black Irish American writer. He had a 1946 bestseller that I consider in my book, that I consider as a writing back to, a response to Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind from his Black and Irish perspective. But the important thing about the term Black Irish was that even though it was Yerby's identity, he talks about his ancestry in interviews, the term was not available to him. And I think that more recently still, the term Black Irish, it's been hijacked, I think, really by white Irish Americans to describe common Irish colouring. I was forced to address the supposed connection to the Spanish Armada in my book, because everybody always asks me about that. There is none. I addressed that. And I think importantly for me that this kind of hijacking means that Barack Obama, for instance, has never been called what he might have been, which is America's first Black Irish president.
Right. The Spanish Armada myth is something we should do a show on someday, but it seems to never die.
It never dies.
Well, we've talked about Gothic literature, or should I say you've talked about Gothic literature throughout the show now, but I sometimes think, and I don't think I really know very well what Gothic literature actually is. I mean, I think of Dracula as Gothic literature, right? But it's so much more than that.
Yeah, Dracula is a great starting point because I think it cements many of the tropes of Gothic, and it's Irish, which is very important.
Right, exactly, yeah.
The connection to Ireland is huge with Gothic. So Gothic is, we all know what it is. We've all seen the films, we've read the books, I think. It's fiction or film with a sinister atmosphere, supernatural atmosphere. It's a setting in which the traumatic past or the dead come back.
Mm.
And it's often concerned, in fact, it's almost always concerned with power and its abuses. Again, Dracula is a prime example of this, I think. So in Gothic, often past sins and the compromises required by obtaining power, by maintaining power, these often come home to roost. I'm particularly interested in the use of Gothic tropes by Edgar Allan Poe and Henry James, who, of course, were both Scots-Irish, as I've said. So in their Gothic tales, there's a kind of a rumination on how past violence unthinkingly repeats, how violence comes down the ancestral line from father to son, and implicitly, I think, from Ireland to America. What I found fascinating is that when I looked at the Gothic of Irish America, the figure of President Andrew Jackson haunts. He haunts the Irish American imagination. He's this ominous spectral presence in works by Henry James and F. Scott Fitzgerald. He was, of course, the first of many Scots-Irish presidents. I sort of compare and contrast Kennedy and Jackson throughout my book. Kennedy was the first Irish Catholic president. Jackson was the first Irish Presbyterian president. And in both cases, I think the ascent to the highest office in the land, it signaled the arrival of their Irish cohort from the off-white wilderness of the early moments, in the American continent. I think in Jackson's case specifically, he asserted his whiteness by absolute ruthlessness to peoples of color. He was himself the son of Ulster settler colonists. He was a major slaveholder. He was the scourge, of course, of Native Americans, most infamously. And I think what was interesting to me is that his treatment of Americans of color is a history that really uncomfortably echoes the role that ancestors of the Scots-Irish played in 17th century Ulster in taking over confiscated Gaelic land. So I think I really gravitated to Gothic because I think it better expresses Irish anxieties, Irish traumatic histories. It better expresses those things than social realism does, even though we're always encouraged to find some kind of truth of Irish American experience in reading, social realist fiction or memoir, indeed.
How is Gone with the Wind, the novel anyway, and we'll get to the movie in a minute, but how is Gone with the Wind Gothic?
Okay, so I keep talking about Jackson as some kind of Gothic villain, and that's not to imply that, say, Catholics fleeing sectarian Ireland possessed some innate sympathy for peoples of colour for that reason. And the reason I'm sort of evoking that is that a quick survey, I think, the work and the antecedents of Margaret Mitchell, the author of Gone with the Wind, it suggests this, and it suggests why Gothic is relevant to her family as well as to her novel, which is not conventionally considered a Gothic novel. So it's a 1936 novel. It begins with the Catholic Irish nationalist Gerald O'Hara, who flees Ireland, and he's happy to seize land for his slave plantation in a Georgia region that had been brutally cleared of native presence. So Mitchell herself is interesting. She was born into a prominent Atlanta, Georgia family. She had maternal Catholic Irish ancestry. Gone with the Wind appeared, of course, in an era of unremittent lynch terror in the South, and that makes it controversial. It was and it remains controversial, I think, for opening with a vision of this antebellum world of grace, both the film in 1939 and then the 36 novel itself. So it's set in the American Civil War. It begins with, as I said, Gerald O'Hara's Georgia plantation. Again, I found history in this novel because I think the rise of Gerald O'Hara draws from Mitchell's own maternal great-grandfather. His name was Philip Fitzgerald. He was Catholic gentry from Tipperary, and in 1836 he acquired a house in Clayton County, Georgia. And by the 1840s, he owned over 1,000 acres in the area. And by the Civil War, he was one of the area's richest planters, holding, I think, at least 34 enslaved people. So the plantation remained in the family into the 20th century. And Mitchell herself, she was raised in Atlanta. She often visited the ancestral Fitzgerald house and lands. How they acquire the land is absolutely fascinating as well. So in the 1810s, that land had been cleared of native presence by no less a person than General Andrew Jackson, who led brutal campaigns against the Creeks in Georgia, which of course resulted in mass transfer of land from Indian nations. So Jackson returns yet again as a spectral presence in Mitchell's novel and in her family history too. I think the novel is Gothic in that the traumas of the Irish motherland are repeated on American soil as well. We have to remember that Gerald O'Hara, he's an Irish planter, was born in Ireland. His family, there's a detail in the novel that's fascinating. I don't think it's repeated in the film, is that his family have been dispossessed by Cromwell. And as a young man, Gerald murders a landlord's agent and he flees Ireland. And he vows in his early years, quote, that the fortunes of the O'Haras would rise again. But of course, it's black bodies who pay for Cromwell's sins in the novel. So Gerald kind of repeats historical seizure. So his ancestral lands were seized by Cromwell, but he himself repeats this. He takes on a plantation in Georgia on lands originally occupied by Native Americans. And in the novel and in the film, the planter, he sees no connection between this sectarian oppression in Ireland that he had fled and the oppression in the South.
But the thing about Gerald O'Hara in the film anyway, there's an incredible amount of what scholars and Irish critics call paddywhackery. That is the stereotypical Irish, especially Irish male. And it's so strong in the film. The character of Gerald O'Hara is played by Thomas Mitchell, a very famous American character actor who was in almost every film of the 30s and 40s of note. Why do you think that's so strong, the paddywhackery that is so strong in the film Gone with the Wind?
I think it's actually an evasion. The buffoonery is an evasion, a huge evasion in the novel and in the film. And he is an idiot to a degree as well in the novel. So let's go back to the antecedents of Margaret Mitchell, the Fitzgeralds. They were this planter family, a gentry family from Ireland who really fell in very easily with the planter order on arriving in Georgia. So I think even though Mitchell had the kind of gentry Fitzgerald origins that F. Scott Fitzgerald actually longed for, she in fact seemed to imagine her ancestors as being kind of semi-literate and uncultured in the Gerald O'Hara style. And he does, you're absolutely right, he draws from this very long tradition of the stage Irishman as a buffoon. But as I said, I think that's an absolute evasion, since I think the buffoonery distracts the reader and distracts the viewer from the fact that he is an enslaver who is seized native lands. The buffoon is harmless, and Gerald is not harmless.
Yeah, I suppose that we should remind buzzkillers that there might be a confusion here. Margaret Mitchell is the author, and Gerald Mitchell.
Right.
It's just that they just so happen to share the last name.
The same last name, yes. That reminds me that John Mitchell,
the
Irish anti-abolitionist, also features in my book, but we won't get into him. He's a whole other issue.
So we don't want people to confuse them, but it does, when you think about it this way, it certainly does make viewing the film rather different. We've sort of sketched out early on the rise of the white Catholic Irish power elite. And this is so interesting the way you've analyzed this in this book, but I don't want to talk about it because you'll be better at talking about it. So please tell us about that rise.
I guess what I do is I take terminology from literature and think about how we perceive history through those kind of genres at times. So I thought about what is the opposite of Gothic? And I think that might be, say, a pleasant fairy tale involving a good and a happy princess.
Mm-hmm.
And so that led me to thinking about the apparent fairy tale of the ascension of a woman of Famine Irish roots to royalty before a global audience. And that, of course, is Grace Kelly. So she was kind of a Cinderella of the television age. And I think one of my pivotal arguments is that she paved the way for the rise of a family of similar roots who became known, and I don't think this is a coincidence, as America's royals. So I think Grace Kelly's wedding and JFK's election were both kind of fairy tales of post-famine Irish full assimilation fulfilled. But again, to sort of draw on the terminology of literature, that dream becomes a Gothic nightmare after JFK's death.
Yeah, but now why Grace Kelly? I think, first of all, an awful lot of Americans who might know who Grace Kelly is don't necessarily think of her as Irish American or of Irish descent, despite the name. They think of the Kennedys. They think of all sorts of other people. But Grace Kelly's not from New York. She's not from Boston. She's Philadelphia. She seems as, frankly, waspy as you can get. But yet, of course, you show that there's a lot more to it than that.
To think about Grace Kelly is to think about a waspy image, but a reality and a history of Irish famine roots. So, but just to get back to sort of your initial thought as to why Grace Kelly, maybe why Philadelphia. So I tried to expand on the kinds of Irish Americans that are generally kind of covered in surveys. I emphasize, women performers, public women, queer, non-Catholic, multiracial authors, performers, politicians, and so on. So one of those super important public women, I think she's central to Irish American status in the 20th century in many ways, is the Philadelphia-born Grace Kelly. I think in 1956, this is when she's a famous movie star. She receives the title of Princess Grace of Monaco. In 1956, let's remember, there was yet to be an American president who shared her Catholic, Famine, Irish background. Despite this patrician image, she was the end point of a multi-generation story that follows, the very broad contours of post-famine Irish experience. She does the whole trajectory. So she was born in 1928 to John Kelly. She was born in aspirational Irish Catholic Philadelphia, which I think is a world that she would really transform. So her father founded Kelly for brickwork, and he became a millionaire in the building boom of the 1920s. But, and this is important, her grandfather, John Henry Kelly, he'd been born into a poor Catholic family near Newport in County Mayo. He was born in the famine year of 1847. And he immigrated to Pennsylvania 20 years later. So Newport is interesting. It suffered really greatly during the famine. And I think it's kind of unsurprising. It actually becomes a center for agrarian agitation. And after the famine, the Irish National Land League, for instance, was actually founded nearby in 1879. Somebody's done an audit of the core Irish literature collection at the Princess Grace Library in Monaco. And it suggests that Grace's politics leaned heavily nationalist. At the very least, she was very attached to Mayo. She's actually stopped at her grandfather's home on her official state visit to Ireland in 61. And in 1976, she actually purchased the cottage and the surrounding land. But let's go backwards, to maybe 56 again. So in the America of her younger years, Catholicism was stigmatized. It remains stigmatized as the religion of the not quite white immigrant, the Irish and the Italians and so on. So I think that we forget how explicitly Catholic her royal wedding was. So it was one of the largest international media events of the 1950s. It was actually broadcast live on television by MGN, and it was watched by 30 million people. So I think for me, this globally visible ascent to the highest echelon really altered the social status of Irish America, really the racial status of Irish America. The aspirational Philadelphia, into which she was born in 1928, was a place in which, if you were a self-improving immigrant like her family, the prize for which to aim was full acceptance into elite, conservative, impeccably white, heterosexual, WASP America. So she was born into money, don't get me wrong. By contrast with her grandfather's cottage, she was raised in a beautiful 17-room home along the main line in Philadelphia. So she was on the Schuylkill River, which was a waterway that divided the new money, the likes of the Kellys, from the old money, Anglo-Protestant social elite on the other bank along, as I said, this so-called main line. So the home was a beautiful one, but of course, in the eyes of the old money mainliners, any kind of gentility would have been punctured by the fact that the house had been newly built with bricks from the family brick firm. So in other words, in a place like Philadelphia, for those of recent immigrant background, wealth and success were not enough for full acceptance. So the assumption in Philadelphia, and it was common right into really the mid-century, was that the post-famine Irish could not really convincingly occupy ranks reserved for those of kind of old WASP family. Could I parse as well? Philadelphia actually had a specific culture when it comes to this kind of hierarchy of immigrant whiteness, because, and this is, I think, one of the cruxes in terms of the difference between it and New York and Boston when it comes to Irish American history, is that Philadelphia was a highly socially and racially stratified city. There was a cradle of Scots-Irish culture. So the Ulster Presbyterians, they started to arrive in the 1700s. It had actually been the main destination for many 18th century Ulster immigrants. And it was almost certainly the disembarkation point for the parents of one Andrew Jackson. So I think central to the story of the Irish in Philadelphia are the tensions between the pre and the post-famine cohorts out of Ireland. So this mainline divide in Philadelphia was ratio-ethnic, was religious, was political. So the Kellys were Irish Catholic and Democrat. Philadelphia society was Anglo-Protestant, Republican. So the Irish in Philly, they couldn't make it in the highest echelons, in part because the Presbyterian Ulster-Irish had integrated earlier. And of course, they'd done so by differentiating themselves from the new Irish. So there were increasing numbers of poor, unskilled, and Catholic immigrants in Philly in the immediate, actually, pre-famine period. And this led to the emergence of Protestant Fraternal Orange Order in that location in the 1830s. I'm really interested, I think, in sort of being specific as well in tracking ethnic and racial tensions in relation to Irish America. Because, for instance, there's a marker in Philly that describes an 1842 post-white mob who attacked Jamaican Americans. But these were actually Irish, if we're getting specific. But what I'm interested in here is that the so-called anti-Catholic riots that ensued 2 years after that in 1844 in Philly, these were actually really anti-Irish riots. And it wasn't some undifferentiated kind of Anglo-American nativist charge. It was actually Irish-born Protestants who clashed with the new cohort of Irish. So again, this seems like, oh, that's the 1840s. What's that got to do with grace? But in 1912 in Philadelphia, the same intra-Irish tensions erupted again at street level. And this was a period in which her father was a young man. And they erupted at street level as a result of a rally against Irish Home Rule in Belfast that was echoed on the streets of Philly. Again, this continual movement, I think, across the Atlantic, the sort of conjoining of the histories at all times. So the great historian of Philadelphia is Dennis Clark, of Irish Philadelphia rather, is Dennis Clark. And comparing Philly to New York and Boston, where of course the Irish dominated, Clark says that the denial of political power to Philadelphia's Irish democratic cohort lasted until the mid-20th century. And of course, this is about the time that Grace rose to prominence. So Grace's father was a prominent Democrat in Pennsylvania, but Catholic Democrats played second fiddle to Scots-Irish Republicans in that state. So by the time of Grace's father's birth in 1889, the legacy of the Catholic Irish being overshadowed by an earlier and by now very kind of British American Ulster cohort is that Philly does not enjoy a reputation as being an Irish city in the style of New York or Boston.
Well, I often wonder also about Irishness and Grace Kelly, because I sometimes think that because of her celebrated beauty, because of her movie star status and all that sort of stuff, her Irishness is sort of taken away from her, and she's seen as not threatening in any way, like the Kennedys become threatening politically and all sorts of stuff. So it seems like Grace Kelly is almost for Protestant and elite America, Grace Kelly is almost the safe Irish. Is that, am I exaggerating? Am I oversimplifying?
I guess we always have to imagine the difference between how we perceive her now and how she might have been perceived maybe on the cusp of her stardom, or, when she was securing her stardom. So she was, of course, as you say, one of the most beautiful actresses of her century. But I think we need to go back farther and look at the very idea of female Irish beauty was a very disputed category in an earlier period. I actually reproduce one 19th century comic Valentine in my book. And the so-called Irish beauty in the Valentine, she has the exaggerated groove between nose and top lip, which we see in the racist ape Irishman of 19th century stereotypes. So it's a mockery of Irish beauty. And I think kind of the trickle-down descendant of that is that there was a certain snootiness in press coverage of Grace Kelly, the movie star. There was an awareness back in the day that she was Catholic in Philly. So in 1955, Time magazine, for instance, it pinpointed the fine and what I think for Philadelphia, the crucial distinction that although publicists tagged, and I'm quoting here, Miss Kelly as a mainline debutante, she was neither mainline nor a debutante, but she's the next thing to both, end quote. So I argue that the packaging of Grace Kelly in the early to mid 1950s by the studio system, that it was actually this ladylike image she had, this was actually meant to diminish the usual associations of an Irish Catholic background in mainstream America in that period. Grace, her voice was actually trained at a private New York Academy of Dramatic Arts in the late 1940s, trained by an Englishman to sound, of course, correct, which in those days would have been upper class, transatlantic, Anglo-American. So her silence as well around reporters, she famously didn't talk very much to reporters. It was really the antithesis, the opposite of the very old stereotype of the Irish as being verbose, which goes right back to Shakespeare. And I think this, this slightly icy but elegant, this ladylike persona was a package. And what I found really interesting was to go backwards. And I looked at the early stage and early television roles in which Kelly was indeed cast as a privileged and beautiful WASP woman. But importantly, all of those scripts were the fantasies of fellow Irish Americans because they were based on plays or novels or stories by her own uncle, playwright George Kelly, or by F. Scott Fitzgerald, or by Henry James. So that really was this Irish American fantasy of elite status. And it really wasn't made real until 1956 with Kelly's royal wedding. So again, just to get into some of, I suppose, our received ideas, we tend to think of the white wedding dress as signaling sexual purity. But in the racialized American context, it's also been interpreted as signaling whiteness and privilege, because let's think about it, a garment like that requires a laundress, a seamstress, a lady's maid in order to remain pristine. And if you remember the opening antebellum scene of Gone with the Wind, I think it's no accident in that scene, Scarlett O'Hara wears this really fussy white gown, high maintenance gown for a high maintenance gal. This 1956 fairy tale spectacular of Grace Kelly's royal wedding, it was very much a white wedding in multiple registers, I think. I think the image of the radiant Grace on her wedding day, that we've all seen, it was the moment that her ethnic cohort's racial whiteness was finally confirmed. I think, again, going back to that moment itself and thinking about being in that moment, that wedding spectacular came only 3 years after the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, which, of course, was another momentous televisual event. Importantly, I think for those of Irish nationalist persuasion in Ireland and in America, Grace's Catholic wedding, it would have seemed a kind of an Irish answer to the crowning of the photogenic British monarch in 1953. Again, also watched on television by millions.
Well, Professor, we can't talk about Irish America, of course, without talking about the Kennedys. And your analysis of the Kennedys and the Gothic is fascinating. Please enlighten the listeners about this.
Yeah, so I guess the election of the first Catholic Irish president came only 4 years after Grace's wedding. But again, Gothic literary tradition, it suggests that, if there's a fair princess in a castle, there's soon to be a nightmare. So I think this dream, this Irish American dream, Gothic vocabulary takes over after the Kennedy assassinations. Gothic is a genre that centers on power and its abuses. So Gothic fit really competing conspiracy theories that depicted the Kennedys as both innocent victims and as wicked schemers. So from its early beginnings, Gothic uses, this sinister atmosphere of conspiracy, and it features an all-powerful, corrupt Catholic patriarch. Thinking about the Kennedy narrative, it also thinks about a secret or a curse linked to a corrupt bloodline, sexual excess, endangered beautiful women, disrupted inheritance, or murdered heirs. So for both sides of America's political divide, the Kennedys seem to fit this ready-made mold, though in different ways. So after JFK's assassination, liberals and Democrats who had approved of his administration's progressive policies, they believed that the idealistic Kennedys were the innocent victims of dark conspiracies. On the other hand, conservatives and Catholic Irish Americans were leaving traditional Democratic Party loyalty behind. For them, America's royals, so to speak, that they represented the immorality of an aristocratic elite.
Well. The book is so, in many ways, it's so comprehensive, but it's also so innovative. I don't want to say something shallow like it's one-stop shopping, but it really does change the way and improve the way I think people will look at Irish America. And first of all, you learn so many things, but also it brings in things like the Gothic that, frankly, I think a lot of people don't consider. So we're so grateful that you came on the show.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. So all I'll say to your listeners is the next time somebody talks about the Kennedy family curse, that's Gothic.
That's Gothic, right. Buzzkillers, the book is obviously on the Buzzkill bookshelf. Go to professorbuzzkill.com, do everything that you do there, and we will talk to all of you out there next week.